things didn't go well for you last week in NASCAR DFS, do not worry. You can chalk that up as being a practice round for this week because there are a lot of similarities at Las Vegas where we had at Homestead. It's another 1.5 mile track. It is a 400-mile race, 267 laps. So there's a lot of overlap between the two races. But there are also some key differences for DFS that will alter our strategy for this race and the way we build lineups. So want to dig into that, dig into the similarities between this week and last week and how things will differ to get you set for Sunday's race. Welcome on into the Heat Check Fantasy Podcast powered by numberFire. That's right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network and numberFire.com. My name is Jim Sanas. I am a senior writer and analyst for numberFire.com, here to get you set for the Pennzoil 400 that is coming up on Sunday. Lock is at 3:30 p.m. Eastern from a NASCAR DFS perspective, breaking down strategies for the race and the top drivers in each salary tier based on the salaries over at FanDuel.com. But first, a lot of good stuff going on here on the numberFire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed, in addition to the NASCAR podcast, which will usually be every Friday, 10:30 a.m. Eastern on the FanDuel YouTube page. We have a UFC podcast with Austin Swain. That will be up on Friday morning, I believe. After the All-Star break, we'll have the NBA DFS podcast with Tom Vecchio back, and NHL is popping as well. So a lot of good stuff here on the numberFire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed. Make sure you are subscribed, and if you like what you hear, make sure you leave us a rating and review as well. We'll take a look at the strategies for this race here in just 1 second. But first, the NBA DFS Single Entry Series presented by RotoGrinders is back on FanDuel. Enter FanDuel's Single Entry Series for a chance at over $50,000 in total prizes. Each week will feature a different kind of single entry contest. You can enter as many days as you like that week. We'll take your 4 highest point totals for a combined score. Finish the week with the highest combined score to win a spot in the single entry championship. That is March 17th, and a shot at the $10,000 grand prize. Other top scorers will be awarded prizes. Head over to FanDuel today. Get entered in the single entry series, even though the contest is winding down still a couple weeks ago, and just good contest in general with the RotoGrinders single entry series. So more details at FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Track breakdown here for Las Vegas, as I said, pretty similar to what we have for this week, because the key thoughts from Homestead will also apply to Las Vegas. We just have to make a couple of tweaks to our thought process because of the way the starting order has been set. The similarities here are that laps led do matter, and that we should accept place differential where we can find it. It is another race at a 1.5 mile track with 267 laps involved. That is plenty enough laps for drivers at the front to have upside. But it's also a race where you can make passes pretty easily, so fast cars at the front, or at the back rather, have big upside. We saw that play out in last week's race where we had Martin Truex Jr. at the front. He made the perfect lineup for starting 9th. That was at least in part because he led 37 laps. So guy at the front led laps in the perfect lineup. But the rest of the lineup was all guys who started 17th or lower. 2 of them started outside the top 30, and those 2 guys actually finished 1-2, which further emphasized the ease of passing. Passing is not as easy as Las Vegas as it is Homestead, not as many grooves, stuff like that. But if you look at the total green flag passes in Las Vegas over the past 2 years compared to Homestead, they're very similar. So passing not as easy, but still easy enough for us to consider guys at the back being good plays for this week. So in that race last week, it was 1 lap leader and 4 place differential options that panned out. I think we need to enter this week again committing to having at least 1 lap leader in every lineup. But our overall build should skew much more toward the front than it did last week. And this isn't because of the track. It's because of the starting order. If you look back to last week, the starting order was based exclusively on results in the 2 Daytona races. And although speed mattered there, they were pretty random. This week, one of the key cogs in the starting order is how drivers finished last week, and that was much less random. And the owner points portion of the algorithm is less messed up now too, because Homestead was 1 additional race of stability versus 2 that were random. So in other words, the starting order this week is a lot less random than it was last week. We don't have as many quality drivers starting in the back of the pack. If you look back to last week, 4 of the top 7 drivers in my model were starting outside the top 10 for the race. This week, there's only 1 guy in the top 7 starting outside the top 10. Last week, 4 drivers in the top 18 in my model were starting 30th or lower. 4 drivers out of the top 18 were starting 30th or lower. This week it's just 1. And he is the only guy, even in the top 29 in my model, who is starting 30th or lower. So even though our broad strategy is the same for this week, we want to get at least 1 lap leader and be open to place differential, the starting order is going to push us to put a bigger emphasis on finding lap leaders and drivers who were at the front. So I'm likely going to have 2 lap leaders in a healthy number of lineups for this week. And some of my value plays are going to start inside the top 15 as well. 1 guy below 10,000 starting inside the top 10 will be on a good number of my rosters. So I need drivers who are going to finish well. And this week, that means I'm going to have to drift closer to the front. The way to determine which drivers will finish well can revolve quite a bit around what we saw last week. Now, I have Las Vegas and Homestead in the same bucket as being flatter 1.5-mile tracks. But they are very different. Las Vegas has higher banking. Homestead has more grooves. We also see more tire fall off at Homestead than we'll see in Las Vegas. So there are key differences, and that matters. But the cars that were fast last week broadly should be fast this week too. The question is how you view the cars that struggle. And those are going to be the big ones we're looking to for place differential upside. You aren't starting deeper in the pack if everything was sunshine and rainbows for you in Homestead. So we're going to have to ask ourselves whether the issues we saw for Eric Almirola, Ryan Blaney, Matt DiBenedetto, and guys like that are things they can fix during this week to have more speed on Sunday. We can also ask if the track is better suited for them than what we saw in Homestead. I will have lineups where I assume that those guys all hit, and I just load up on place differential via those drivers who did struggle last week. But I also think there is value in having lineups where you just fade that group entirely and just sell out to target drivers who were fastest last week. It will lead to a more front-heavy roster, but with 267 laps, I think that is a fine plan. So I would try to ask yourself whether those drivers who struggled last week can rebound this week, and if you think that they can, be high on them because place differential does matter here as well. But when you do that, make sure you are still getting a driver at the front and, make sure you are still valuing laps led even while trying to hunt those drivers down. And I would mix in lineups too, where you just assume that the struggles guys like Blaney, DiBenedetto, Almirola had last week carry over into this week too. So overall for this week, the strategy is pretty similar. You need at least 1 lap leader per lineup, a guy starting in the top 10 or so, and then you could go more than that, but start with at least 1 and accept place differential where you can find it. It's just tougher to find it this week than last week. I'm likely going to wind up having 2 lap leaders in most of my lineups. The value plays will often come from inside the top 15, even though that comes with increased risk. I think it's pretty necessary for this week to have drivers at the front, both for your studs and your value plays, just because I need good finishes. That doesn't mean I'm selling out for William Byron because he's starting second, but if there is a driver I like who is starting near the front and maybe undervalued, I am going to use them because there's just fewer place differential options in place this week. Finally, just determine how you want to handle those who struggled last week. I think that there is value in making assumptions and that last week didn't matter as much, and there's value making the assumption that it did. Fill out lineups based on that, decide how you want to handle things, and go from there. We'll talk about how I view those drivers through the tier-by-tier breakdown. Speaking of which, let's do that right now. Going tier-by-tier based on the salaries over at FanDuel.com. Starting off with the elite tier on FanDuel. That is Kevin Harvick at $14,000 through Denny Hamlin at $12,000. And most of these guys are starting near the front. The one exception is Logano. Joey Logano starting back at 15th. We'll talk about him in a second. Kevin Harvick is my favorite, though. He is $14,000. That's for good reason. He is starting on the pole, which means he has easy access to laps led. And it can be pretty tough to pass the leader in Las Vegas. We've seen Logano win at this track basically by blocking the entire race. So if you get out front, get that clean air, you can hold on to that lead for a long time. That's valuable for Harvick. He wins in my simulations 14.5% of the time. So there's actually a tiny bit of value on his outright bet at 6-1 at FanDuel Sportsbook. He has had a top 4 average riding position in 3 of the past 4 Las Vegas races, led 92 laps last year. So I like Harvick a lot. He is my number 1 driver in this tier for Las Vegas. Martin Truex Jr. starting 4th. He ranks 2nd in my win sim, so I'll put him 2nd on my list as well. I like that a lot. Really fast last week. Good car, good track for him too. But let's talk about Logano. because he's different, because he's starting 15th. He is $13,000, and Logano has a great track record here. He has won 2 of the past 4 races in Las Vegas, and he led more than 100 laps in one of the races he did not win. He also won the playoff race in Kansas last year, which has a lot of similarities to Las Vegas. The issue with Logano is that you need to pair him with someone starting at the front to lead laps early. Like, this is where the you need one lap leader thought process plays pretty heavily. That could be Harvick, that could be Truex, but if you get a guy at 14,000 or 13.5 and pair him with a guy who's at 13,000, that's a pretty top-heavy roster, and it does require a unique roster construction. I can make that happen because there are guys in the 5,000 range who I like for this week, but it is something to keep in mind that Logano is expensive, and you need to pair him with a guy who can lead laps early. It does put you in kind of a hole from a roster building perspective. So I'm going to rank this tier: Harvick 1, Truex 2, Logano 3, Denny Hamlin 4, out of no disrespect to Hamlin. I like him a lot. And Chase Elliott will be number 5 for me, even though Elliott was really good in Las Vegas during the playoffs. The second tier on FanDuel is Kyle Larson at 11.7 through Kurt Busch at 10,000. And Larson could be one of the guys to target in your Logano lineups because he's starting third this week, lower salaried than Harvick, and lower salaried than Truex as well. Now, Las Vegas, not as good of a track for Larson as Homestead, where he tends to, lead a ton of laps and mop up. But the Hendrick cars as a whole were crazy fast across the board last week. We saw William Byron run away with it, but Larson was really fast too. Elliott was up there contending. Alex Bowman was pretty solid, but I think that's enticing. And Larson wasn't bad at Las Vegas with Ganassi back in his old ride. He finished top 3 in 3 straight races at this track at one point. So Larson would likely be a really solid choice in your Logano lineups. It's a lot easier to accept 11.7 as your lap leader with a $13,000 driver than a 14,000. So I think that Larson might be one of the top guys to consider if you do decide to go with Logano starting back in 15. 2 guys starting further back in this tier are Ryan Blaney and Kyle Busch. Blaney starting 26th and Busch is 14th. My model is not as high on these 2 guys this week as it was last week, in part because they didn't do a whole lot last week, and that factors pretty heavily into things. But Blaney has a lot of room for error starting back in 26th. So he doesn't have to be as great to pay off. He actually almost won this race last year. Bad pit strategy put him in the back. Shocker that happened last week, too. It tends to happen. Like, the strategy for the Penske cars is maddening. If they can find a way to not, bite themselves, they could do really well. That happens a lot, but we should account for that. But he's 10.7, starting 26th. That's enticing. Busch never really got going last week, and his recent history on the 1.5 mile tracks is not as good as Blaney's. So I will be higher on Blaney than Busch. And I think that is pretty definitive for me, where I prefer Blaney over Busch. With the salary savings, I am going to rank Blaney first in this tier. I'll actually go with his teammate, Brad Keselowski, second. He's 11.3 and starting in 10th. He doesn't fit as well with Logano as Larson does. He's starting a bit further back, which is why I didn't linger on him at the top. But Keselowski, really good numbers at this track. Just Fords in general tend to dominate here. Keselowski, good numbers on the 1.5 milers last year. So I do like Keselowski number 2 in this tier. I would go with Larson third, Kyle Busch fourth, Kurt Busch fifth. Kurt Busch is always kind of my kryptonite. I tend not to use him because he doesn't dominate races and doesn't lead a lot of laps. But he's $10,000, starting 7th. Really fast car last week, so I'm putting him 5th. I feel like I should always be higher on him than I am, but there's reason to like him. I just tend to like him less. The mid-range on FanDuel is Alex Bowman at 9.5 through Matt DiBenedetto at $7,800. And I like this tier a lot. That's a big part of why it's tougher for me to go all out in jamming in both Logano and either Truex or Harvick, because if you do that, it makes it harder to get back into this tier. The 3 names I love in this range are Alex Bowman, Christopher Bell, and Matt DiBenedetto. And the appeal in DiBenedetto, I think, is pretty obvious, despite the fact that he is taken a flamethrower to my bankroll the first couple of races. He started back in 30th, and as I mentioned before, he is the lowest starting driver among the relevant guys in the field. But he actually did finish runner-up in both these races last year. I think that he is probably the first guy I lock in for cash games, honestly. I want to be overweight on him in tournaments again. It has not worked out so far this year. It has been very bad, in fact. There's a reason he is starting 30th. But I'm just going to keep on going back and hope that it gets better. He was running fine last week before he had some issues. He had issues at the road course. He had issues at Daytona. So here we go again. Let's just see if it can hit this time. Bell is starting in 16th, and I think that his upside is being slept on again, which is weird considering he just won 2 weeks ago. Because, after he won, people were super into him last week. But they've obviously cooled very quickly because he's $8,500 and he's 33-1 to win the race. I think he is the best win value on the board from a betting perspective. My win sims have him at 4.5%. His implied odds are 2.9%. He actually ran well on the 1.5 mile tracks last year, even while in lesser equipment. And yeah, the Joe Gibbs cars didn't really light it up last week, which includes Bell, but Truex ran well. Denny Hamlin would have been in contention had he not been speeding on pit road. So Bell will be a focal point for me. Starting 16th, not a ton of place differential there, but $8,500. If he gets you a top 10, he's going to pay off. And I think there is a chance he could be top 5, maybe even a little bit better than that. So Christopher Bell, really good option there as well. Bowman is just for tournaments, but I do like him a lot there. He is starting 9th, which is why he's just a tournament play. But he ranks 8th straight up in my model. That's pretty good. His average running positions in Las Vegas last year were 8th and 6th. He has 4 straight top 10s on the 1.5 mile tracks, and 3 of those were top 5 finishes. If you get a top 5 out of a guy at $9,500, he is going to be worth it. Now, I say this while acknowledging I was just talking about how I was low on Kurt Busch before. He and Bowman are pretty similar. I just think that Bowman's equipment is a lot better, and thus the odds that he dominates this race are higher. So I wouldn't go too hard at Bowman because the margin for error is lower, but I think he can win this race. So I want to have enough to benefit from Bowman if he does get me a top 5 or a win, and I think that's within his range of outcomes for this week. So I'm going to rank the guys in this range in that order: DiBenedetto 1, Bell 2, Bowman 3, but they're all awesome plays. I'd put William Byron ahead of Austin Dillon in this range. Dillon starting 12th. A little bit of place differential upside there, but Byron was just so good last week, and I think that there is reason to think that could continue. Been good in Las Vegas in the past as well. So Byron ahead of Dillon for me, despite the difference in their starting positions. The value plays are Eric Almirola at $7,500 through Ricky Stenhouse Jr. at $6,000. Now Almirola is another guy who needs a bounce back this week, but I think he can get it. He is starting 28th, and that's because things were brutal last week. And he's not going to win this race, but he will have the equipment to move through the field. So he might be able to make the perfect lineup, even with just a top 15 finish, because $7,500 starting 28th, it's a lot of wiggle room there. So Almirola, I think he's a cash game play. I'll be very in on him. Kind of similar to DiBenedetto, where it didn't pay off last week, but I'm willing to go back once again this week. I'm also into his teammates, too. Cole Custer and Chase Briscoe. They are starting 20th and 24th, respectively. So there's upside there from a place differential perspective. And Custer isn't starting deep in the pack because of a bad run last week. He was actually in the top 5 pretty late in that race. He was running 7th when he cut a tire with 2 laps left. So his 14th place average running position is solid and shows that he had a good race there. He's $7,300, good finishing upside. I like that a lot. Chase Briscoe, as we discussed last week, was awesome on tracks like this in the Xfinity Series, including specifically this track where he won both Las Vegas races. So I prefer Custer between the two because of how much speed he had last week, but all 3 of Almirola, Custer, and Briscoe deserve to be core plays here. It is taking a bet on Stewart-Haas Racing, but I think that their record on the 1.5 mile track says that's worthwhile. So I will go back there this week, despite some struggles for the non-Custer drivers last week. The punting tier, not terrible. It's Ryan Newman at $5,700 on down, and there are a couple of guys here I'm willing to take swipes at. The first one is Chris Buescher, one of my old favorites. Had a lot of speed last week. I did not expect that and didn't use Chris Buescher, but he was awesome. He actually won a stage. He did fade in the second half, and that matters. But that's awesome how fast he was. His average running position was 10th in that race. He is starting 18th. He is $5,000. He makes it a lot easier. If you want to go Logano Harvick or Logano Truex, Buescher makes that a lot easier, and maybe you can get back up into that mid-range too. So I'm fine doing that because we have him down in 18th. So I'm going to go at Buescher this week and hope that speed from last week carries over to this week. He actually was top 10 in the second Las Vegas race last year too. So not as if he came out of nowhere. I think that there's been a lot of talk this week about how the smaller teams like Roush Fenway Racing and JTG Doherty Racing may be able to make gains. Front Row Motorsports might be able to make gains this year because there's been a parts freeze. There's been some changes to the wheel wells. So if we buy that narrative, Buescher may be good again. So I'll take Chris Buescher at $5,000 as well. The other guy who interests me down here is Bubba Wallace. Not a huge showing last week, but he's starting 23rd and is $5,300. And I think his odds of competing for this win are just as high as Buescher's. And Buescher's outing last week might lead more people his way than Bubba's. So Bubba's another guy to use if you want to be more top-heavy or if you want more exposure to the solid middle tier for this race. Ross Chastain not totally out of play here either, so it's really not a bad week to punt. But I do think when I say punting, I mean put your floor at like Buescher at $5,000. I'd rank them Buescher 1, Bubba 2, Chastain 3. All those guys are options. I'd like to have them be more like rotational plays, I would say. Like, I'm okay having Almirola, Custer, and Briscoe in my core. I wouldn't want these guys to be quote-unquote core plays, but Buescher, 20 to 30% exposure, Bubba 20%, Chastain 10 to 15%. I can get behind that for sure. I think that is realistic for this week. So like to avoid this tier when I can, get the higher finishing juice out of the Stewart-Haas racing cars. But, if I want to jam in Logano, I think they do make sense, and I'm willing to do that for sure this weekend. Let's finish up here with picks to win for Las Vegas. As always, one guy above $10,000 on FanDuel and one guy below. The guy above, I'm going to trust what my numbers say, what my simulations say, and they say Kevin Harvick's got a pretty good chance this week. He is, again, 14.5% to win in the simulations. He ranks first in my model by almost a full position ahead of Martin Truex Jr. So I'll go Kevin Harvick here. Really good car on the 1.5 mile tracks, easy access to clean air. I'll take that for sure. So give me Harvick at the top. Beneath, I think I've picked him a couple of times already. I know I picked him last week, but I'll go Alex Bowman again. It was William Byron who dominated last week, but Bowman has been really good on this track type. He actually got a win a couple years ago on the 1.5 mile track. I think he can pull it off. If you look at the model for me, among guys below $10,000, I believe Bowman's win odds are highest. Yeah, he's highest, followed by Byron, followed by Bell. And I could definitely be talked into those guys. Byron's win odds are shorter from a betting perspective, so I'm not going to bet him. But I think that Bowman and Bell are both guys I would be willing to bet at their current numbers based on the odds at FanDuel Sportsbook. That is all the time that we have for this week. Once again, next week, back to Friday, 10:30 a.m. Eastern on the FanDuel YouTube page. Make sure you are subscribed there, but also make sure you are subscribed to the numberFire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you hear, leave us a rating and review. Big thank you to Calvin Theobald, our video producer, for running the video side of things here today. Thank you, Cal, as always. If you have any questions for me, I am on Twitter at Jim Sannes, JimSannes. You can also follow the FanDuel Podcast Network at FanDuel Podcast. Good luck to all of you as you fill out your NASCAR DFS lineups for this weekend. We'll talk to you once again next week. I believe they're in Phoenix next week, which has been a good track to me in the past. So I'll talk to you then. This has been the E-Check Fantasy Podcast powered by numberFire.